Hi, and welcome back to part 2 of our mini-series about the British General Strike of 1926. If you haven't listened to part 1 yet, I'd go back and listen to that first.
Oh, you men of tawny pandy who dig the veins of coal, with me little pick and shovel I'll be there. For the boss may own the colliery, but he'll never own your soul. With me little pick and shovel I'll be there.
Our podcast is brought to you by our Patreon supporters. Our supporters fund our work and in return get exclusive access to podcast episodes without ads, bonus episodes every month, free and discounted merch and other content. So our supporters can listen to all 3 parts of this mini-series now, as well as an exclusive bonus episode with more information and context. So if you can, please join us and help us preserve and promote our history of collective struggle. Sign up and listen today at patreon.com/workingclasshistory. Link in the show notes. The strike was scheduled to begin at 11:59 p.m. on Monday the 3rd of May. However, unofficial action in some areas was already beginning over the weekend. On Sunday, printers at the right-wing Daily Mail newspaper refused to print an editorial which claimed the general strike aimed to inflict pain on innocent people in the community. On Monday, printers at the Star, the Evening Standard, and the Evening News took similar action against similarly worded editorials in those newspapers. And on Tuesday, the Times and the Telegraph newspapers were also affected, even though the general strike hadn't officially started at the time they were supposed to be printed. Once the strike officially got going, however, the response was overwhelming. Ministry of Labour figures put the number of strikers at between 1.5 and 1.75 million. On top of this, there were around 1 million miners who were locked out. This was out of a total population of only around 40 million, whereas today the UK population is closer to about 70 million. Workers had brought the UK to an almost complete standstill. Harry Watson was asked about whether there were any scabs on the East London docks.
No, not a soul. They brought in the Navy, and we knew that things like that were happening from the fact that many of the blokes who had been going round, not picketing as such, because it was a solid strike, but nevertheless, chaps were going round to see what kind of reaction they were meeting with from various shipping bosses and port bosses and what have you. And when they saw some tugs underway, they were rather astonished and went to make closer investigation and found that they were manned by Navy personnel. I didn't know anything about this at the time, but I do know that when we did return to work, there was crates of empty beer bottles aboard, quite a lot of them, so they must have taken great care of their needs for liquid refreshment, if nothing else. Mainly the strike committee was made up of the more senior men. We were carrying messages here and there because we could move faster. Some of us had bikes and some were on foot.
On many occasions, police would try to disrupt strikers' meetings.
And I was attending at meetings, Effecton Road particularly. There was a meeting there on the 4th day, which was a very big meeting, well attended and well orderly, and the speakers were giving reports of the situation up and down the country, and suddenly, from out the blue, dozens of mounted police drove in amongst a lot of us, and my cousin, who was with me at the time, got knocked down, and as he got knocked down, he was in such a temper at what had happened, he jumped up and knocked the policeman off his horse. And of course, that led to more trouble in that sense, that seeing one bloke get knocked off his horse, they were trying to knock everybody else off their horses, And that was a real shambles for about 20 minutes, 25 minutes. Half an hour it was, platform went over and I don't know what became of the speakers, but they certainly busted that meeting up. And that was quite a peaceable meeting.
Rail workers were similarly solid. Among members of ASLEF, the train drivers' union, it was said that, quote, not 50 out of 50,000 members failed to answer the call, end quote. And among the National Union of Railwaymen, more took part in the 1926 strike for the miners than for their own strike in 1919.
Well, the Justice for Branch Secretary came down to the station, just for Branch Secretary anyway, came down to the station and said that the strike was starting on a certain date and we should all explain the circumstances and we should all be expected to be out.
This is C.S. Hollis, a member of the National Union of Railwaymen in Chesterfield.
Well, I was on at 5 o'clock on the morning of the day the strike started. I made my mind up that I wasn't going and I didn't go. I think, as far as what I recollect now, most of the staff went on at 5 just to see what was happening, but they came out. So we all reported to what was then the NUR headquarters at Chesterfield, which was the old Marquis of Artington in Salisbury Street, public house. But that was the strike headquarters. And of course we gathered there and we heard what news there was. There wasn't the transport, etc. that there is today. And different chaps volunteered to cycle between different branches to set the shifts. I mean, branch secretaries weren't fitted up with telephones with the early latter days, and so it meant in effect what we call runners. You used to run from one NUR branch to the other to find out what the position of things was, you see. I was a good trade unionist. I've been in since I was 15, when I started on the railway. And as soon as the branch secretary came down and said, well, we'll be out, the strike starts at midnight. Well, I didn't hesitate. I didn't go to work, and we all thought the miners had got a good case. We thought, having regard to the economic condition of the working class generally, everybody got a good case.
While Chesterfield rail workers were mostly solid, some local buses with low levels of union organisation were still running.
What is now the East Midland Bus Company was run by a firm known as Underwoods in those days, and they haven't a very good reputation as far as I remember as employers. It was a non-union firm, and we began a bit concerned locally that these buses were running about and giving a service. One night at the NUR branch, NUR meeting, was we prepared to go down and try and stop the first bus coming down. So I was young and enthusiastic at that time, 21, and we went down. We arranged to be down there at 5 o'clock. There were quite a number volunteered to go down. They were full of enthusiasm overnight to go down next morning. Well, finally, about 5 of us turned up down at Underwoods, as it was then. And we said, well, what we're going to do, lads? They said, well, we thought the best strategy to do was to link hands and stand straight across the road so that when the first bus came out, he'd see us there and he'd stop. But anyway, he got other ideas. He put his foot down and came through the gate, and he put his foot down, and because he put our feet down and got to the other side of the road, so he got through. So we found out that there was no question of peaceful picketing. Those who wanted to wait just came out with a rush.
The situation in Chesterfield in the first few days of the strike was fairly reflective of what was going on nationally. Despite the huge numbers of volunteers, ultimately very few were able to do the skilled jobs which kept the railways going, leading to rail traffic being almost completely stopped in the first 2 days of the strike. Most rail companies were only running as little as 4 or 5% of their usual volume, while freight trains weren't even hitting 1%. Local buses and trams, often being less organised and requiring fewer specialist skills, were able to run some semblance of a service, though often significantly reduced. For instance, out of approximately 2,000 trams, the London General Omnibus Company was unable to run a single one on the first day of the strike, and by the next day they only managed 86. The use of untrained volunteers on rail and transport often resulted in entirely predictable consequences with regard to public safety, as Hollis notes from his experience in Chesterfield.
Anybody that were considered suitable to drive a train, well, they were allowed to do so. And going through level crossing gates was a regular feature. Some of these amateur drivers, you know. The level crossing gates at Bayton fetched down once or twice because one old chap was a bit of a whip among others, but I think some of these amateur drivers, or some of these volunteer drivers, I think they have a new set of gates for every train.
While Hollis was able to poke fun at these amateur drivers that he saw driving through level crossing gates, this kind of ineptitude was seriously dangerous, and in some cases, fatally so. For instance, on the 10th of May in Edinburgh, a collision between trains killed 3 and hospitalised 13, while in Bishop Stortford, just north of London, another collision killed 1 and injured 3. Ironically, these took place on the same day as the infamous Flying Scotsman incident, where striking miners removed a section of track to stop trains, but the inexperienced scab driver of the Flying Scotsman train continued anyway, leading to its derailment. Despite only causing 1 injury and thankfully no deaths, the story of the Flying Scotsman is often repeated as an example of supposed Union thuggery putting the public at risk, while the other 2 incidents, caused by inept scab labour and leading to 4 deaths in a single day, have largely been forgotten. In the end, Hollis and his colleagues found out the hard way that scabs wouldn't be put off by a few strikers getting in their way. And in fact, the aggressive behaviour of scabs had likely been emboldened by the state's preparations for an almost literal war with the unions. In other areas, however, strikers and their supporters were more assertive in their disruption of strike breaking.
The Trades Council, like all trades councils, had set up a committee, which some of us saw was the Soviet. It wasn't, but at least we thought it was.
As a reminder, this is Betty Harrison, who we heard from in part 1 and was a textile worker at the time of the strike. The word Soviet that she uses here is another name for a workers' council, a body established by workers to coordinate struggles which could potentially take over the management of society, as had happened in Russia in the early days of the 1917 revolution.
And we went along, some of us. We didn't go officially from the textile workers because we weren't on strike, but we went along to try and help out this committee to run errands. I mean, I was only 22 then, wasn't I? And really full of revolution. I'm a member of the Independent Labour Party. And we went along to help, and students came and this kind of thing. And some people were blacklegs and tried to run the trams. So the students, some of we young ones, went along and turned over the trams.
The term blackleg that Betty uses here is an old word meaning scab or strikebreaker. Interestingly, in many, and possibly most places around the country, students actually formed one of the core groups providing scab labour, with recruitment taking place directly at universities themselves, sometimes with the active cooperation of university administrations. But Betty says that in Bradford, many students actually supported the strike because they were attending the technical college and were from working class backgrounds themselves. With regards to the turning over of trams, Betty answered as to whether or not she was involved.
I think I can say so after all these years, can't I? I couldn't say so for years because it was illegal. But we did things like that. We made everybody get out, of course. But they ran on rails. Well, if there was a fishing hobby and you rocked it and rocked it and rocked it, then it fell over, you see. You pushed it over. Because, you see, it was on rails anyway. It wasn't just on the road. And so you just toppled it over, It sounds easy, but... And of course, then it blocked the whole way for a long time, you see. But after we'd done it a few times, then they couldn't get the blacklegs to run the trams because the blacklegs then thought they were going to get into trouble because the students made no bones about it. They just pulled them off the trams, you see, and then knocked the tram over. And the blacklegs were lucky they didn't get hurt because the students were furious at them. They always get scabs, and whenever there's a strike. I don't think there were all that number. Can't remember how many there were. And as I say, after a few trams had been turned over, there were less. The first day, if I remember correctly, they ran about a quarter of the service. And then the second day it was less, and then it petered out altogether. And people walked to work or cycled to work, those who were working like the textile workers, you see. They just had to walk to work.
Around the East London docks, further clashes between workers and security forces kept taking place.
Meetings are being held, and Beckton Road in Canning Town was one of the places where speakers used to be every Sunday, and it was like a noted place for speakers on the corner of Beckton Road by Barking Road, opposite Trinity Church. And of course Blackwall Tunnel, outside the main gate of the East India Dock, was another noted place for mass meetings of the kind. Well, they were taking place. Plenty of police, mounted police and foot police, but nobody took any notice. It was quite a peaceable affair. Until one morning we had heard that there were troops in the docks unloading ships, and the lorries were coming up the Victoria Dock Road, manned by the troops. Of course, as a result of that, everybody turned out to see just what substance there was to this report that we'd been given. And sure enough, when we got to the Barking Road outside Canning Town Station, which is facing Victoria Dock Road, up came the lorries with barbed wire all around the lorry's canopy, with troops with guns sitting behind the barbed wire. And the people were jeering and booing, but that was the extent of the feelings, you know, of the people. But for some reason, I don't know why, where I was standing, there was plenty of shouting and booing, as I say, but certainly nothing in the way of physical reaction or anything of that kind. There was still a degree of good humour about it. But the police started pushing from behind. Instead of being in front of us, they were behind, and they kept pushing and pushing and pushing, and we were being pushed further and further in the road, and it led to arguments. And before we knew it, the police were laying about us with their truncheons, and that caused more anger. There was a real explosion there for about half an hour. It was a question of hitting back to defend ourselves from what the police were trying to do to us, and succeeding in doing it for quite a lot of us. There was a few broken arms as a result of the blows that we had been subjected to.
However, the dockers made sure they were better prepared the following day.
The following day, before they went up to the main road, hundreds of the men walked along the side streets, and in those days the houses used to have a very low wall in front of them, about 2 feet high or so, and then they had railings embedded in the walls for about a further 2 foot, so that you had spiked iron railings in the small walls, and the men just ripped the iron railings out of the walls and took them along with them up to Barking Road. And when I got there was several lorries already that had been turned over. Not lorries that had troops on them, incidentally. These were lorries, private contractors, and whoever was driving them had been forced out of their wagon, and the men and women were turning the lorries over, and I say there was 3 or 4 of them already laying on their side. And then up from Victoria Dock Road came the lorries with the troops on it, and then again the police lined up. Some were in front of us, but most of them were at the back of us. But before they could start anything, the crowd turned on the police and started laying about with their iron bars on the police. And of course the casualties were in reverse ratio to the previous day.
We'll be right back after these messages. If you want to listen to our podcast without ads, join us on Patreon, where you can listen to all parts of this mini-series now, as well as an additional bonus episode. Support from our listeners on Patreon is the only way we're able to devote the time and money it takes to make this podcast. Learn more and join us at patreon.com/workingclasshistory. Link in the show notes. These kinds of clashes were taking place all over the East End.
We heard subsequently that what had happened to us in Canning Town was also at the same time almost taking place in Poplar, and that there was in some respects a far more vicious situation there, where the mounted police had rode in among the strikers and rode some of them down, when they were running up side streets, the police were chasing them in the side streets into the doorways and houses. So that although ours was bad enough and exciting enough in that sense, theirs was even worse. I don't know why that was, but that's how it was at the time. However, that went on to the point where instead of soldiers just merely being outriders, as it were, on the vans, or riding shotgun, as they call it, on these vans coming up from the docks, they brought in, I'm not sure whether they call it a regiment or platoon or whatever it is, but they marched troops through Barking Road. When they got to Camden Station, they halted, and then there was some pompous little twit of an officer in the front who gave somebody an order and who called out, fix bayonets or something like that kind, and they fixed their bayonets. And then they started marching along the main road, both sides of which were swamped with workers and their wives and that sort of thing. And of course, whether that was done to intimidate the workers from attempting anything similar to what had taken place the previous day.
In some areas, workers even set up self-defense corps to resist police interference with pickets, and some of these could actually be quite large. In the town of Methill on the Fife Coast, it could sometimes involve up to 700 workers armed with sticks to face down the police. Formally organised self-defence like this was mostly uncommon outside the Fife coalfields. However, Emil Burns' excellent survey for the Labour Research Department found that about a dozen other local trades councils around the UK had also set up similar types of self-defence organisation. Historian Keith Laban also notes that there were riots in a number of cities, including Plymouth, Hull, Middlesbrough, Edinburgh, Preston, Crewe, Nottingham and Swansea, with the worst clashes taking place in London, Doncaster and Glasgow, with the clashes in Glasgow alone leading to around 200 arrests. All of this stood in stark contrast to the instructions from Trades Union Congress leaders to stand firm and keep order.
The trade union leaders did make a concerted effort to appear moderate and to be moderate. They told people to be quiet and keep smiling and go home and play with the wife and kiddies in a rather patronising way.
As a reminder, this is Judy Cox, co-author of Revisiting the General Strike of 1926, when workers were ready to dare.
And so you have got this image of the strike as a sort of British strike, a strike where sort of, cloth cap workers had games of footy with genial, smiling bobbies on the street. And it was just a kind of community outing and sports event rather than a militant class confrontation.
Bobby is a British term for police officer, derived from the name of Robert Peel, who set up London's Metropolitan Police in the early 19th century.
One of the important things about the research that we've been doing is just how far many strikers went beyond the peaceful picketing. They didn't go home. They didn't just go and play football with the bobbies. They used all the means at their disposal to stop scabs and to fight back against the police who defended the scabs. And so there were very, very militant confrontations during the strikes. There were people dragged out of taxis, dragged off buses. There were trains derailed. There was the deployment of troops. They marched with fixed bayonets down the Barking Road to Poplar because there'd been quite a lot of confrontations in the East London docks. There were riots in Hackney. There were riots in Glasgow. I mean, these were not stoic British workers accepting the moderate line of the TUC. They were stoning scabs. They were threatening people with physical violence and indeed, smashing up shop windows. In one instance in Glasgow, a scab was thrown through a shop window. These were people who were fighting for their lives, and they were not going to stick to some kind of peaceful, moderate narrative. They were going to fight with every means at their disposal. And I think sort of exposing that level of violence is important, not because anybody wants to revel in violence. We all want to focus on the great liberatory effects of the strike, but it showed that British working class people will fight, tooth and nail, just as militantly as any other working class group when they have that collective sense of strike and struggle to buoy them up. So it was at times a very violent strike for the reasons that people were fighting for their lives.
It's thought that there are at least 500 councils of action or similar bodies around the country organising the strike. And though the TUC's last-minute planning meant that most trades councils had been left waiting until late in the day to prepare, they still managed to pull off an impressive feat of organisation. Councils of action set up various subcommittees, they issued permits for goods which were allowed to be moved, organised picket duty at sites around their local areas, they distributed hardship relief to their members, made arrangements with local consumer co-ops, they arranged speakers for what were sometimes huge open-air meetings, and organised recreational activities like sports and concerts. There were also around 70 local bulletins, which would be distributed by the thousands to update people on both local and national developments in the strike. It should also be said that these local bulletins often went beyond the orders of TUC leaders who wanted to control all union communication on the strike, and on the 10th of May actually ordered that all local bulletins should cease publication. All of this is not to suggest that local councils of action were necessarily hotbeds of radicalism, though obviously there were areas where radicals played leading roles. Rather, they were disciplined trade unionists, which in some ways was actually a double-edged sword. Once they received their instructions from the TUC, local trades councils faithfully put them into action, to the extent that the instructions themselves were actually clear. But this didn't just mean calling members out on strike, but also ensuring that those who weren't called out stayed at work. A report from York Trades Council was fairly typical in this regard. Quote, "Our greatest difficulty is to keep the men at work who should remain there. They all feel that they should be out helping in the struggle." End quote. While the TUC had completely failed in terms of its preparation, this was made up for by its members' enthusiasm and willingness to support the strike.
I wasn't living in the centre of Bradford. I was living quite a good distance, mile and a half from the centre. And to go down to the meetings, I had to walk this mile and a half, you know. But I didn't mind walking. I ran most of the way anyway to get there to the strike, where there's something doing, you know. Because where I was, and no strike in the textile industry, there was nothing doing. It was as quiet, it was just normal, except the trams weren't running. But I wanted, as soon as I left work, I was rushing down and running a mile and a half to get there, you know, and to try and help this Trades Council committee. There was only one other girl in my shop went with me. It was too far for them to go, they said. And besides, you know, a lot of them were married women anyway. They weren't all youngsters like us. And it was only we youngsters who were able to go down. And some of us couldn't stay all the time because some of them were like me. I was in the position that I had an invalid mother and only me to look after her. And my father had died. He died in 23. And so my mother and I were living together, and I couldn't leave her too long. From our Bradford committee, I think about 5 or 6 of us were the only ones who were able to go and do any help. And we were full of enthusiasm, although there wasn't a right lot we could do in 9 days anyway, and working during the day and just going in the evenings. Yes, they got out a little sheet, which was like a strike bulletin, giving us the information of what was happening in other parts of the country. And that was one of the things which we used to go around helping to deliver, you see, because there was no transport to send it out. And the boys used to go on bikes, and some of we girls borrowed bikes and went too, and gave it to certain people who were secretaries in factories and this kind of thing, and we gave them a number of these so that they could distribute them inside their factories.
This enthusiasm was shared also by Harry Watson, who remembers how resolute East London dock workers were in supporting the strike.
No, I didn't get any strike. No. Wasn't even looking for any because we were used to doing without in those days. I don't think it worried us to that extent. Didn't worry me anyway. Wasn't anything fearful to us to be out of work, you know, whether he was on strike or whether he was just out of work at the employer's behest. We saw more dinner times than dinners. That was part of the way of life. I don't think the impact was all that different in the strike period as compared to any other period. It was never, what you can say, more than hand to mouth at any time. It wasn't all that different in our standard of living, as it were. It didn't alter all that much, but there was a strike on.
One way in which workers like Harry were able to continue during the strike while getting no pay was via a system that some union branches had set up with local shops.
We got some tokens that we used to take along to various shops that had agreed to supply us with food, and the score was settled after the strike was over, and our branches were paying out cash to the various shopkeepers. They made sure that we had food tokens, to get certain foods.
These tokens would be given to local shopkeepers who would be paid by the union on their members' behalf, and then afterwards the member would pay back the union. Of course, because the General Council of the TUC had left all its planning to the very last minute, arrangements like this were entirely local, which meant the ability to get food to striking workers differed greatly from place to place. This was particularly stark in relation to the Cooperative Wholesale Society, which was a federation of consumer cooperatives rooted largely in working class communities, and was the forerunner to the supermarket chain currently known as the Co-op. In some areas, local CWS co-ops helped trades councils significantly. In some places, they gave striking co-op members credit up to the value of their usual shop or some other fixed sum, and in Coventry, the Cooperative Society even gave the trades councils the use of a car, which was quite incredible considering how rare cars were back in those days. However, in other areas, relationships were far less friendly, particularly where unions were blocking the transport of Cooperative Society goods. As Emil Burns wrote in his Labour Research Department survey, quote, "The General Council's failure to develop its policy to meet the special needs of the cooperatives or to outline any plan for utilising them was keenly felt by the trades councils during the general strike." End quote. As mentioned earlier, numerous heavy clashes between strikers and police took place during the strike. This was part of a wider campaign of repression.
The British ruling class, they had an Emergency Powers Act from 1920, which they'd invoked to suppress the Bolsheviks under the bed and so on after the big upswinging struggle in 1919.
By Bolsheviks under the bed, Judy is referring to the paranoia around supporters of the Bolsheviks, the Russian Communist Party who came to power following the 1917 revolution, who the British ruling classes suspected of using the general strike to bring about revolution in Britain. This spectre of communism was used as an excuse for the state to try to clamp down and crush the strike, but workers were prepared to meet them head on.
Oh, you men of tawny pandy who dig the veins of coal, with me little pick and shovel I'll be there. For the boss may own the colliery, but he'll never own your soul. With me little pick and shovel I'll be there.
That's all we've got time for in this episode. If you'd like to listen to part 3 now without ads, then do support us on Patreon, which is how our work is funded. There we'll talk about how the strike was defeated through repression, the organisation of strikebreakers, and the capitulation of the TUC leadership. You'll also get access to a bonus episode in which 2 of the participants we've heard from in these episodes, Betty Harrison and Harry Watson, talk more about their life and work around the time of the strike, as well as union politics more generally. It is only support from you, our listeners, which allows us to make these podcasts. So if you appreciate our work, please do think about joining us at patreon.com/workingclasshistory. Link in the show notes. And if you can't spare the cash, no worries. Please just tell your friends about this podcast and give us a 5-star review on your favourite podcast app. Also be sure to check out generalstrike100.com to find out more about events commemorating the general strike in your area and beyond. You'll also find a ton of historical markers highlighting the locations of specific incidents that took place in cities, towns and villages around the UK during the strike itself. Also, if you'd like to get a copy of Judy's book, Revisiting the General Strike of 1926, you can find a link to buy a copy on the webpage for this episode. On the webpage you'll also find more information including further reading, images and sources. Link in the show notes. Thanks to our Patreon supporters for making this podcast possible, and a special thanks to Jazz Hands. Our theme tune for this episode is Montaigne's version of When the Coal Comes from the Rhondda, a folk song originating from Welsh miners in the early 20th century and sung during the general strike. The song is performed by Montaigne and mixed by Wave Racer. You can find a link to download the song on our website. All proceeds go into medical aid for Palestinians. For more from Montaigne, check the links on the webpage for this episode. This episode was edited by Jesse French. Anyway, that's it for today. Hope you enjoyed the episode, and thanks for listening.
When the coal comes from the Rhondda, when the coal comes from the Rhondda, with me shovel and me pick and me little lamp and a wick, when the coal comes from the Rhondda, I'll be there.